Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation with Sarah Watson, Kimberly Perry, and Barbara Chow. I'm Joe Waters. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Capita, and I'm delighted that you have been able to join us today. Capita is a nonprofit think tank exploring how the great cultural and social transformations of our day affect young children, and we foster new ideas to ensure a future in which all children and their families flourish. Sarah Watson and Kimberly Perry are longtime advocates on behalf of children, and we're delighted that we were able to bring to you all their wonderful and practical paper on building an advocacy infrastructure to support our children and families with a particular focus on equity. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah and Kim for their presentation, and then we'll come back in a few moments for a conversation with them and Barbara Chow. Sarah?
Great. Thank you, Joe. So glad to see so many friends out there on the webinar. I want to thank Joe for being a wonderful publishing partner. We were thrilled he was interested. Kim has been a wonderful writing and thought partner. And I want to thank my former employer, the Bainham Family Foundation, for supporting the time to write the paper, noting that the opinions, of course, belong to Kim and me. And finally, I want to thank the children and youth advocates and the funders across the country who I talked to get the wonderful examples that go throughout this paper. And if you weren't in this paper, there will be more. So we welcome more examples of your great work across the age spectrum. So thank you. Let's go to the next slide, please, Joe. Why do we need this paper? Why, add to everything that's out there? The only way for foundations and advocates to achieve their goals is by supporting policy advocacy. Yet it is still only a small part of the portfolios of most foundations, and advocates struggle to put together the resources that they need to affect fundamental, long-lasting change. We heard many organizations commit to a racial equity journey after the murder of George Floyd and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, and they have to support advocacy in order to achieve those goals. Campaigns are complex undertakings. I'd argue that it's harder to enact policy that promotes equity than it is to build the tallest skyscraper. We wouldn't think of hiring random experts and not coordinating their work, not making sure that we had all the expertise we needed working together in order to undertake a project of that magnitude. And it's the same with advocacy, and that's especially true of campaigns that both put community voices front and center and also are arguing for resources on behalf of the families and children who need them the most. So our practical paper, I love that word, I am nothing if not practical, walks through the major elements of the campaign infrastructure. We do need funding for this. One foundation doesn't need to do it all, but it all needs to come together in some way in order to achieve policy change. So now I'm going to turn it over to my partner, Kim, a brilliant strategist, to walk through some of the elements in the paper. Over to you, Kim.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So we'll go to the next slide. And I want to say a couple things before we start. I know Sarah thanked a couple of people, but I also want to first say that this is very personal for me. And so it was such a pleasure for Sarah and I to sort of put pen to paper on our career experiences and life experiences. I have a family. I have raised my daughter in an environment where we've been in a community that has historically been marginalized, where I grew up in a community where we've been discriminated against and ignored. So I'm uniquely familiar with the experiences that many of us are trying to solve for. And I've been fighting for equality and equity my entire career, really trying to elevate the voices of those that are closest to the pain. So this is a really personal journey for me. The other thing I want to mention is that all the slides that you'll see, but also what was in the paper, is because we've had this experience of being on many sides of the equation. Again, I mentioned that I've been a member of a community that needs resources and that has been ignored and needed investment. But like Sarah, evolved into an advocate who's been on the planning and the orchestrating side of this work. And we've even had the experience of being the funder who's facilitating that investment. So maybe that's why it came across as practical, because it really is steeped in our own experiences and our own practice. This work is really hard, and while we need more of it, we want people to be actively engaged in doing it across the country, and so many people are. And so what we aim to give you was clear, concrete examples. Just by reading the paper, you've got a network of people doing the work already. So you don't have to feel alone, and foundations have a network of other funders who are already making the investments and understand just how complicated it really is. So looking at the slide in front of you, the big picture, a couple of the pieces that are often, I think, bypassed in the funding relationship and process and applying for dollars is just asking for time to think about how you're going to put a plan together, to have new ideas, to plan a safe space to create a joint agenda. These are where you're determining who your collaborators are going to be and why, and time to really put all of the pieces together. You see an image here of the Meyer Foundation's Fund for Black-Led Change, and it is one of many examples across the country, but certainly they are blazing a trail here, responding to just the need for Black leaders to have investment, to think about how they will mobilize and organize their communities for change. Next slide. I want to just talk a little bit about the core elements to promote equity, and I will start here, and then Sarah will round it and wrap it up. The first piece is capacity to organize. And so many foundations really understand the concept of mobilization, which is usually reaching people through already established organizations, through digital methods, to influence, or through digital methods, but really to influence lawmakers with their very own constituents, especially their constituents that are closest to the pain. It really requires relationship building, trust building, and time-intensive strategies that are going to get people involved for the long haul. So making that change, holding lawmakers accountable, and that really complicated work has to be funded appropriately. We outline and give an example here of our Under 3 DC campaign here in the district, where we have a commitment, for example, to include parents in lawmaker meetings. Not easy, but it's a part of our principles of true equity and inclusion, and that the people closest to the pain need to be the architects of the work. And another example we outline is the good examples from Parent Voices Oakland and Ole in Mexico. Looking at decision-making and infrastructure, and I'll kind of go through these quickly. So these inclusive campaigns really need clear lines of responsibility. We really just wanted to call out the need that campaigns are really fast-paced. They often require rapid response, and so you have to have clearly delineated roles, and decision-making authority needs to be set up and set and clear up front in the campaign before things get started. Another example from our Under 3 campaign is that we have an executive committee who has ultimate decision-making authority, and that executive committee is majority-led by women and majority Black-led organizations. So again, staying true to our equity principles, ensuring that people closest to the pain and who have had lived experiences are also ones in the driver's seat and the decision-making role. Message development and communications. Messaging has to be really detailed. Most people think about the broad media messaging, and then they think about the targeted social channels, but there's so much in between because you are trying to get many people with broad and diverse experiences on board in development of the message, and then of course to amplify the message. We provided you some really good examples. The American Heart Association's Voices for Healthy Kids have a message wheel, which I love. It really shows key themes in a really succinct way that a broad diversity of coalition partners can understand, take it, and really run with it to ensure that it is aligned with the work that they do every day or the living experiences they're living every day with their families. Data research and analysis. So the inclusion of research and analysis partners is really key in the campaign. I often talk about our close relationship with DC Fiscal Policy Institute. Many funders across the country fund state tax and budget groups. And then also many funders are now funding the Children's Funding Project, which helps campaigns and public financing investment strategies to groups all across the country. And that's important just because lawmakers often need data to really understand the impact or to be able to persuade their colleagues. That those research experts are often useful in helping to make the arguments, and it's based on credible qualitative and quantitative data. And then finally, I just want to mention the importance of funding professional development and organizational development. If funders want to see more of these initiatives led by people of color or by people who have lived experience and want them to be successful, they really have to carve out time and resources for professional development. It's really critical. Things like executive coaching, skill building workshops, access to professional and social networks are a clear part of learning and growth opportunities that leaders could really use. In the paper, we highlight the McCormick's Foundation's partnership with Purpose. Check out purpose.com. They provide support and development to movements and campaigns across the country that are working on long-term change. And then finally, leaders also need training and support on how to strategically increase their capacity. And so funders can help with that. It's quite overwhelming to just have an organization receive a lot of money to support a campaign without thoughtfully thinking through how they will strategically, thoughtfully, and carefully build that capacity over time to get the job done. So things like expanding IT support, gaining or contracting legal counsel, or even bringing on marketing support. All of that is really necessary for a viable campaign that will last through a win. Sarah, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Going on to the next slide. The last set of elements addresses both C3 and moves on to C4 activities and goes beyond the types of looking at policies to looking at people. Sometimes you need to go directly to candidates for election, as well as to engage voters in a whole variety of ways, registering, actually, getting them to the polls, et cetera. And you can do this on a C3 basis. You just have to be a little more careful. And funders have been even more reluctant to fund this type of work because it does need a bit more care, but it can be done. And there are wonderful examples in the paper, and we show an example from a great Georgia group that has done a lot of work in terms of educating voters and candidates. Sometimes you also need to allow groups to step over that advocacy C3 line to lobbying. Community residents, especially people of color and people who are not professional advocates, when they take time out of their schedules to meet with policymakers, it's not only ineffective and awkward to ask them to only tell their story, But it's really disrespectful and disempowering of them to not allow them to ask directly for the policy that is needed. This was a great insight that Kim shared that we really wanted to bring out in the paper. So it is really important that funders need to give some flexibility to their grantees, not earmarking money for lobbying, but giving grantees the flexibility to do the usually small amount of lobbying that is necessary and that is allowed by law. Sometimes advocacy groups also need to take the next logical step and engage in electioneering or taking a position on candidates for office. Sometimes no amount of education is enough to change the mind of an elected official. And we simply need to have different people in office who reflect different constituencies, different life experiences, and different perspectives on what's needed. And so in order to do that, of course, organizations need special funding and administration. So let's talk about 501c4s, which are the nonprofit version of organizations that do allow funding to take position, allow their members to take positions on elected officials. So I've been interviewing state and national advocates who have created C4s, and I truly feel this is the wave of the future for children's advocacy. It simply puts advocates in an entirely new plane. And people who have recently been able to create C4s have talked about how different it feels to be able to engage directly with candidates instead of just doing the public education. So there are some cautions, obviously, about engaging in electioneering, but it's an important part of the toolbox to consider. And especially with the relatively new tax laws that mean that smaller donors don't get a tax benefit from C3 donations, they can just as easily donate to C4s. So I strongly encourage groups to think about that if your funding allows it. So the last element in the paper is talking about funders as true partners, thought partners, strategic partners, risk partners, not just in the money that they give, but funding advocacy is different from funding programs. It's different in terms of the timing, how fast the results can come, the variability of outcomes, and the risk that's involved. So foundations do need to think about how it affects different functions of the foundation, depending on the size. It could affect their communications capacity, the way they administer their grants, their strategic planning, the work of their legal counsel, inside or outside counsel, the way they evaluate grants. But with thought, this can and it needs to be part of their portfolio. And here is a great time for us to sing the praises of Boulder Advocacy. I think Leslie Barnes, I saw, is in the chat. So a big shout out to Leslie. So many of you know about their publications and their free hotline, but I wanted to point out a couple of assets. One is that they're constantly coming out with short pieces that address the exact political situation that we're in. They are just so incredibly nimble. Second thing I wanted to address is that they offer low-cost webinars that are open to anyone on really practical topics. You can see why they're a group after my own heart, on something like record keeping, for example. And I noticed that the March 17th webinar is entitled Foundation Support for Lobbying. I promise we did not coordinate that, but it is the perfect topic. And I would respectfully invite anybody on the webinar who is a funder or works with a funder organization to publicize this wonderful resource among foundations nationally, because foundations do need to hear just straight talk about what they can and cannot do from not just their grantees, but true national experts, and Boulder Advocacy definitely is that. And I think Joe is going to post in the chat the link directly to that webinar. And I'll just also mention that when I was at Bainham and also for one of my new clients, it was a pleasure to hire them to train our staff and our funder and advocacy colleagues on the rules around advocacy. It was a modest investment. I probably shouldn't say that because they probably want more money, but it was well worth the investment. So I'm very appreciative of their terrific work. Let's go on to the next slide, Joe, please. Couple things we wanted to close out with. One is, I know we are in some ways preaching to the choir in terms of the need for robust infrastructure for advocacy to all the advocates on the phone. And really big question is how to get funders to invest, which is why we were so thrilled that Barbara Chow would join us. So a couple of suggestions from, as Kim said, I've been sitting on both sides of the table. Many of you I've known from my years at the Pew or at the Bainham Family Foundation. So the biggest argument, I think, is the leverage that is involved. They can get such a big impact for the amount of money that they invest if they'll invest in policy advocacy, in addition to continuing their community support. Wonderful study that showed just what the ratio of return on investment is. I also think it's important to offer a menu of options. I've talked to a lot of foundations who think, oh, I have to be a really big foundation or I have to pay for the whole campaign in order to make a difference. And so thanks to, with Bainham's support, I put together this publication that's listed here, and Joe will also put the link in the chat that gives examples of how foundations can be involved in policy advocacy, from relatively small things to really big ones. So there really is a role for foundations regardless of their size, their scope, their risk tolerance, et cetera. So I really think it's important to kind of figure out where they can get started. There are often common questions that foundations have, and they've had for a while. And the good news is there's pretty good answers to many of those questions. They ask about measuring progress. There's actually quite a good literature now on evaluating policy advocacy. So there are specific measures that we can agree on between funders and grantees to know that we're on track or maybe need to change course. Legal compliance, we mentioned that. And the big question is how to be bipartisan, even now. It's still possible. I know everybody on this phone is struggling with making sure that the issue that they talk about is bipartisan at both the state and federal levels. I continue to think it is possible in order to do that, in order to move forward. I think another really important thing is to provide peer examples from other funders and philanthropic service organizations. And I can guarantee you that almost any foundation is a member of a professional group where they're getting information from their own trusted professional peers. And so getting those philanthropic service organizations to talk about the valued role that funders play in policy advocacy is really important. So I did a webinar for the family philanthropists last month. I did one for the Maryland Philanthropy Network, and later this month doing one for Philanthropy Delaware. So I think it's just really important to get this message in front of those groups. And also in the chat, I know Joe's been really busy. His fingers have been very nimble. Just a couple of examples. The Council on Foundations has a whole policy advocacy page with a toolkit for their members. And the Center for Effective Philanthropy also did a wonderful 5-part blog series where they profiled their members in talking about their role in policy advocacy. And they also did a survey of their members in terms of the CEO's opinion about their foundation's roles in policy advocacy. So those are some great resources to share for a peer group. Let's go on to the next slide. And then we are going to open it up quite quickly to questions and discussions, so which Joe will facilitate. So go ahead and open up the chats and the questions and answers. And in particular, I know many people in this audience have wonderful examples of what your funders are doing or the advocacy infrastructure that you're really proud of, and we'd certainly love to hear that. Kim and I had so much fun in this paper, didn't we, Kim? That we want to do another one that is looking at how do you design policy advocacy campaigns with a racial justice lens. And this is everything from kind of the big vision to really the practical, strategic, tactical aspects. So this is, again, more about the kind of nuts and bolts of advocacy campaigning. I also I'm going to be starting a series of posts on individual aspects of the advocacy campaign infrastructure. All of you know that, you know, every 2 paragraphs about a particular element of the structure, you could write a whole book about each one. And so I want to do a series of posts that delves more into that, including more examples from your work. So please send them along. I also would like to do a piece. I think there's been a lot of attention on how flexible children's advocacy groups have been in terms of in the COVID era, in terms of just the pragmatic aspects of their work. But I think there's been less attention to how they pivoted in terms of their advocacy agenda. Groups had to change from offense to defense very quickly. They had to change their specific policy asks very quickly, you know, as quickly as they needed to figure out how to use Zoom and work from home. So I really would like to profile the degree to which advocacy groups were so nimble in changing their advocacy agendas during the state legislative sessions in particular. So we really welcome more examples from all types of issues and ages. We have a lot of great examples in here on early childhood, but we really think that this campaign structure applies across the age range and certainly across a wide variety of topics relating to children and families. So keep them coming. I promise I have a special folder for them. I will keep them. Some of them that I couldn't use in my previous Bainham paper showed up in this one. So I really just want to celebrate your great work. So let me just close again by thanking Joe. We were really thrilled that he was interested in publishing the paper. He did such a great job of formatting it, and also wonderful job in terms of helping us communicate the paper. It's wonderful to work with Kim. Thanks to all of you who are so dedicated to the lives of children and families and are coming through very, very difficult times to keep pressing forward to get families the resources that they need. And last but not least, thanks again to the Bainham Family Foundation for all of their support. Well, we'll toss it back over to Joe. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah and Kim. Wonderful presentation. And Barbara, thank you for joining us. Barbara Chow is the Education Program Director at the Heising Simons Foundation. And we're delighted that you could join us to reflect a little bit on what we've heard from Sarah and Kim, and also the investments that Heising Simons and other funders are making in building this advocacy infrastructure. So I would love to just start with a very basic and somewhat generic question, Barbara. Why are you funding policy advocacy? And I would just, yeah, go ahead.
Well, sure. Well, thank you. First of all, it's wonderful to be here, and it's just wonderful to see all the participants. There's so many friends, colleagues, our grantees on this list. There's many people that could, you know, easily be teaching the book on this topic, and people that I've learned from for many years. So why do we fund in policy advocacy? For many of the reasons that you've already heard. But let me just point out 2. One is this leverage argument, and I think Elizabeth referred to it with Children's Funding Accelerator also in the chat. But there's, if you look at philanthropic data about early childhood funding, what you'll see is, and there's a database actually housed at the Early Childhood Funders Collaborative, that foundations in 2020 spent, data's not perfect, but it's the best we have, about 166 million on in early childhood total. The federal government in 2020 spent about $23 billion, and it's sort of regular normal budget process and an additional 10 billion as part of the Coronavirus Relief Act. So that's 33 billion versus 166 million in total. And you can just sort of see that the numbers alone, there's enormous leverage, obviously, if you can take the great ideas that are out there and use the public sector funding to kind of scale that. So there's, I think, one important reason. And the second, it really has to do with equity more generally. Early childhood is, what you really see is that policy has this profound impact in the early childhood field. And it's I think, a force for great good and for social justice. And it can be weaponized at the same time. And we've sort of seen both of those things happen. The great good is that it's, enormous amount of, there's been a lot of suffering within the sector over the past year with many childcare centers and homes having to shut down because of lack of revenues, lack of enrollment, higher costs, or needing to perversely stay open for essential workers, but also sort of not really having the revenues or the resources to be able to do so. So that there's enormous debt that's being incurred. So forces of good, or the federal government, really, the public sector has been responsive, has been starting to support the sector in important ways. That's good. But it's also, I think, early childhood is very much seen, or child care, as kind of a personal, like a negotiation between parents and providers. It's not a public good. So it's a very grudging kind of a world, I think, where sort of dominated by this sense that the federal government is or public sector somehow or other giving this charitable benefit to families as opposed to them having that right. And that has all kinds of implications for the way it's actually delivered. There are a lot of income caps. There are crazy things that families have to go through. And Kim knows this well from DC, that, that to qualify every few months, it's a really bewildering process. And I think if you're an equity advocate and you're either you yourself or you're supporting that, getting in there and really understanding how this can be working and how it can be a force for the kind of justice that we're looking for is key. So I'd say it's both for good reasons and also as a defense against some of the harms that policy can cause.
Thanks, Barbara. In the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd last summer, we saw many funders step forward and make commitments to racial equity. So 2 questions. First of all, do you think those commitments will last? And secondly, are funders seeing a connection between the statements that they made about racial equity and the need to invest in advocacy? And how are these conversations going now, over 6 months since then, in funder circles? What are you hearing?
Let's see. I mean, it's a great question. I'd say I am certainly hoping that they will last. And I think the reasons for optimism are threefold. One is that I've been in philanthropy for 12 years now. And I'd say over the past 5 years, I can't think of a conference I've been to that did not center issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion as kind of the core conversation that was occurring. So this is, well, I think a lot of this sort of came to, a head and with the racial reckoning last year, it's a conversation that's been around now for a while. So that's good. And I think the other sort of reasons are that it's shifting from a rhetorical, I believe, a rhetorical conversation where people put out statements to one where foundations are deeply thinking about their own culture, about who's in these foundations, about the staff. And I think that can lead to sort of longer term change. And I'm super excited that there's this sort of a deep questioning about our practice, our grant making practices. I mean, we have many foundations, for example, provide grants just to a select set of organizations that it already knows. It doesn't open up its grant process at all. That's an example of something that I think is beginning to shift. So I think there is reason for optimism that this is not just a, one-off or something that people say in response to a really terrible moment, but something that will last. And your second question was sort of how are they connecting this to advocacy? There's been I think many foundations, many have been funding in policy advocacy for a while. The one thing that I think has shifted, and I think it's a really positive shift, is there's much more interest now in organizing and supporting grassroots organizing. It's still very small and a very nascent area, and one that needs a lot more support. So if there's any foundations out there that are thinking, where can I put my marginal dollar to make a really big difference, I would urge you to put it into grassroots organizing. And I've seen just a lot more interest in that, I would say, than I think there has been in the past.
That's great. Kim and Sarah, this next question, feel free to come on back into the conversation. Received an audience question that I'm going to phrase this way. When parents tell us, for example, that they'd rather be able to stay home with their kids longer in the first year of life versus relying on childcare, how are we advocating equitably for that empowered choice versus advocating for equitable programs, which are often what we're talking about when we're thinking about going to government, for example, and asking for their investment? So whoever would like to take that one on, jump in.
I'll start. I think that we are talking about an advocacy infrastructure that supports a wide range of supports for parents and families. So it's not just childcare or early education or preschool, but it includes paid family leave. It includes healthcare. It could include a guaranteed basic income and a variety of other supports that really are meant to help families and children regardless of the parents' work status.
And I will only add to that, absolutely right, Sarah. There are policy solutions geared towards supporting families, and we see many of those choices in communities of color, and they should be respected and supported in exactly the same way. So that's such a great question. Thanks for that.
And Barbara, do you have thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think my thoughts, I would agree with that. I actually think that just, I heard this before in the wars in K-12 around charters versus sort of district schools. I think parents, every choice should be a good choice. So if parents want to stay home with their kids, they should be able to stay home with their kids with generous leave policies. If they want to put their kids and their babies in care, they should have high quality options to be able to do that. So, I think the world we want to strive for, and foundations and nonprofits want to strive for, is a world in which every choice is a good choice.
That's great. Wonderful. Thank you. So we have some questions coming into the Q&A, and I would encourage others to jump in here. First question from Leslie. Do you have any tips to help increase parent participation in lawmaker meetings, especially at night? How do we make sure that parents are able to engage as constituents and advocates with those who represent them? Particularly when those lawmakers are not necessarily available at night. Kim, do you want to start?
Yeah, would love to. 3 things come to mind. First, flip the script. Who says you have to bring the parent to the policymaker? Bring the policymaker to the parents. Parents are working, they are busy. That is not always possible. And so we have adopted strategies like creating and hosting our own town halls and meetings, and we invite our DC council members in, and believe it or not, they love it. They're used to it. They go out into the community all the time. Number 2, if you are planning to meet council members where they are, you have to plan and you really have to prepare families. So careful selection of families. If you have good organizers on the ground, they are already going to know the stories of which families' experiences perfectly, or at least most closely, match that of the hearing or the meeting with the policymaker or lawmaker. And then third, last but not least, but really important, we pay them, provide them a stipend, make sure it is in their best interest to come, make sure they are going to be heard, they should not be marginalized in the meeting, provide childcare if they need it. If they need to bring a child with them, have extra staff in a waiting room in an office where they can be taken care of safely and securely. So you have to ask parents what they need to make the commitment and bend the rules or adopt the rules within your organization to make it happen. So those are three important ones to start.
Thanks, Kim. And I just want to pick up on something else you said there, making sure that the parents do not feel marginalized in the meeting. How would you recommend organizers go about making sure that that happens? Or does not happen, that they're not marginalized in the meeting? Sorry.
Yeah, there has to be time and space made for them. But again, it goes back to that preparation. They should know what's going to happen in that meeting. They should have a download on who the lawmaker is, who are the staff in the room, what do they care about, if they're crotchety or not, or if they're nice and friendly and champions or not. And I think the piece that is harder for folks, I think as professional advocates, we feel like we have to lead the conversation, we have to open it up, we have to guide it and use all our savvy experience and skills, but we don't. Families really should be given fair opportunity to begin that conversation with how personal the issue is for them, why they're taking time out of their busy life or away from work to participate in that meeting. That says everything to the policymaker that this is real. This is not scripted. And finally, they need to be encouraged, prepped about how to make the ask. They should not go into a meeting just to tell their story. They need to realize and step into their own power to say, I'm telling you this story because I need you to fully fund childcare, early education for infants and toddlers. It means everything to me. It is going to make a difference for my family. So those are a couple of things to start. And I will just give a shout to organizations like Spaces in Action in the district, but Center for Community Change, or now Community Change, often does workshops like Storytelling 101, what's your story and how to stick to it. And it really preps and prepares parents on how to feel comfortable telling their story and what to expect in meetings with legislators. So anything can be done with good planning and good preparation, and they feel more confident to be able to go in.
That's great. And I just want to point, sorry, Sarah, just a second. There was a comment that I just want to follow up on there, Kim, with what you're just saying about how in this COVID era, we need to make sure that parents have the technology for meeting with their legislators, iPads, hotspots, and those sorts of things, which make it possible when in-person meetings are not possible. Sorry, Sarah, go ahead.
Just one other thing I wanted to say about the DC campaign is that they made a commitment that meetings with policymakers would include parents. And any of you who've ever tried to schedule a meeting with a policymaker and you know how precious that time is and how difficult it is, and the thought of canceling it if a parent can't show up is physically painful, but they did it. So that just shows really how important it was to have a parent voice in the meeting, or at least a community member's voice in the meeting.
That's really great. Barbara, I want to, since we're talking about parents, I want to come to you and ask about funding parent organizations, organizing parents. What are you seeing there across the country? What maybe are you all doing to support that type of organizing to really empower these parents, not just to have a conversation with the legislators, but to make their voices heard across the board?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. Actually, we just last week released a new request for proposals for a program called we're calling Families Lead California, and it's all about trying to support organizations of parents of young children who are focused on I think eventually perhaps taking a policy advocacy approach, but we really want to just sort of start with the families themselves. And we think that there's some great organizations like Parent Voices in California, but we're a huge state, and there's a need for many parent voices, I think, within the state to kind of take charge and to have agency and to have support and have funding. And one of the things that we've learned about this process that other foundations may also find is that our system processes are not well set up for this kind of open type grant making, where we take many different proposals from across our state in this case, where the decisions that are made by sort of the community at large, as opposed to just one program officer. So there's many ways which we've already had to kind of adopt and adapt to a different form of grant making just in this Families Lead. But it's on our website, the Heising Simons Foundation website. If you want to take a look at it, it's our kind of attempt to do just exactly this.
That's great. Thank you. Sarah, I want to come to you with this question about ballot initiatives and how we both, really fund the campaign around even getting on the ballot. What are you seeing there? Because we've had some success across the country when issues impacting kids and families are on the ballot, they meet with a great deal of success. So
it's a great opportunity. Question. And this was an amazing year for ballot initiatives. I know we have Elizabeth Gaines from the Children's Funding Project and Children's Funding Accelerator in the chat. And they, through their C4 that they've just created, supported a variety of ballot initiatives that were successful. And Joe, you can find the statistic that Elizabeth posted early on in the chat in terms of the ROI. It was really impressive. So one thing to bear in mind about ballot initiatives that's a little tricky is that in ballot initiatives, because the public are the ones that are voting on ballot initiatives, then they are considered legislators in terms of deciding what is lobbying and what is public education. So the type of direct advocacy to the public that would be not considered lobbying in another context can be considered lobbying in a ballot initiative. So that means that groups that are working on ballot initiatives do need to have even more flexibility with their resources than ones that are working on just getting legislation enacted in a legislative setting. So I would say that there have been, a number of very successful initiatives that I hope we will learn from. I'm sure the Children's Funding Project is going to extract some good lessons learned from what happened in 2020 so that we can figure out how to move forward.
And I think I found that, Sarah, it was $2 million invested in 7 places this November will net over $2 billion over the next decade for kids. So $2 million invested in advocacy, $2 billion over the next decade invested in kids. Barbara, I am going to come back to you as we begin to think about wrapping up, but we have one more question. Do parents seem interested from the audience? Do parents seem interested in the issue of child care provider compensation, or are they more interested in how they're paying for child care? And more broadly, any thoughts about how we can sort of exploit the intersectionality, so to speak, between the needs of parents and the needs of workers? They may diverge in places, but I would imagine they come together in a lot of other places. So maybe Kim, if you don't mind starting off with us on that one.
Well, that's such a great question. We've been asking ourselves that same question. We're actually doing a round of parent focus groups and some message testing just around that, because just anecdotally, we haven't done anything formal. Parents care about it, but then I think what steeps in is the fear of their tuition bill increasing. But they understand that early educators need a fair and living wage too, and should be compensated just like other teachers in the system. But it is in our best interest to fully fund our bill, because it's a key question for policymakers too. And so we'll let you guys know. We'll circle back with you this summer and let you know where we landed and what we learned. I think Elizabeth was putting something in the chat too about some case studies.
Yes, she says case studies are forthcoming, but there's an Early Learning Nation article which is in the chat to all attendees if you want to take a look at that. Barbara, I would like to ask you that question as well, since not only are you funding parents, but I believe you're also funding organizing of workers in the workforce. Can you talk a little bit about the intersection, the contact zone between the interests of workers and the interests of parents, and how we can exploit that for good things?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I do feel like it's a really false choice, because parents pay more than, sometimes more than college tuition for childcare, and yet the workforce has paid poverty wages at the same time. So the only answer in my mind is public sector funding. And that a lot of the organizations that we work with support both providers and parents, because when you pit them against each other, that really is a lose-lose. I mean, you think about sort of the K-12 system, that the parents there aren't saying teachers shouldn't be paid more because that's going to somehow or other affect me, and they aren't saying that because it's a universal system, it's a public good. And so that kind of moving the early childhood world into a public good universal system of care, to me, I think, or parents again staying home with their children, I think that's really my North Star, and that's how I would like the day when we're not fighting with each other over these sort of scraps.
Great. So on that question about public good, I have noticed, at least in what I'm reading, what seems like 1,000% increase in the use of this language around public good, specifically as it relates to childcare, but it can apply to any number of other areas. And that, to my mind, requires not only policy advocacy to get legislators to act as if something like childcare is a public good, but it requires a cultural shift as well. Sarah, can you talk about how we not only advocate and build the infrastructure to advocate for policy change, but to advocate for the enabling conditions in the culture that make policy change possible?
I think that this requires a lot of storytelling and going to where people's moral core is. And I think that this is the Frameworks Institute really has this right, that that arguing on for what we need based only on kind of data and head space is not going to be enough. And we really need to understand people's emotional attachment to this issue, and how we show them that what we're trying to do is consistent with the emotions that we feel for kids and families in this country.
Great. Kim, did you want to jump in on that?
I didn't. I was reading what was in the chat, to be honest with you. And I think it was an exchange between Albert and I think Elizabeth asking the question, do parents even know? Are they aware what the actual salaries of early educators are, and to see that some of them, are woefully underpaid as a sector, and would that change people's minds? So.
Right, great. So we're almost out of time. It's unbelievable, but I want to thank you all again for contributing and for the great questions. I'm going to wrap it up with a question for each of you, and I'm going to start with Barbara. And this is a variation on a question we ask at the end of every Capita webinar, what's a project you've dreamed of funding, but haven't yet seen come across your desk?
I can give you an example of a project which is nascent, and I would love to see many more of them. And it's a project actually working with family childcare providers to take that first step, because it's a relatively fragmented sector. Again, people are just doing this in their own homes. Is to begin to help them take that first step towards organizing by supporting them, people that aren't even part of an organization yet, to start working with other family childcare providers by even if it's just sort of early conversations. So I think it's those first catalytic early steps before something even exists that I'm excited about seeing many more of them, because that's really we talked about kind of grassroots, and many times the grassroots organizations already are further along. This is pre-grassroots. It's that first spark. And we've seen some work on that, and I'm super excited about where that's going to go.
Great, thank you. So Kim, I'm going to ask you a similar question, and it is really what's the issue that you've dreamed of working on, but yet haven't had the bandwidth or the funding and need support to work on it in DC?
Joe, I feel like that question is so loaded. As soon as you said it, I was like, wow, there's probably a list of 10 things. But the one thing I will point out that's consistent, and I feel like I've been aiming for this my entire career, and it just comes and goes because oftentimes funding is trendy. And so it depends on what's happening in the world. And I mean that, I don't know, for what it is. I don't want it to sound too negative, but it's true. And that is sort of what we've been talking about, is just more inclusion of parents. We often say there's no constituency for kids. Policymakers don't care about kids because they don't vote. Well, parents do, and parents care about their children, but there have not been enough dollars going to organizing organizations for them to do their work with the capacity, the full and true capacity needed to do it with integrity that respects the communities they're working in, and to sustain over time. Many of these organizations are so good, and they attract excellent, well-skilled organizers, but they can only stick around for 3 to 5 years, the length of time of a grant or a funder who really believed in them. And that's really unfortunate, because in a community, you have to start back over again, right? There's all that institutional knowledge is gone, and that's really a shame. And that has an impact on the community-based organizations and the advocacy organizations that they were partnered with. So we all sort of lose, and we have experienced that in the District of Columbia since I started my career organizing and doing advocacy around Medicaid and CHIP and the summer food service program and national school lunch program. And that's a shame, because we need some sustainability in that part of the sector.
Great, thank you. And Sarah, for you, briefly, what is the next frontier for building advocacy infrastructure to support children and families? What are you dreaming about?
Developing joint agendas to create a massive force that can get what we want for children and families. I think, for example, an issue just as important as early education is housing. It doesn't do much good if you have the best early education system imaginable if children have unstable housing. So, and it is a false choice. We cannot be trading these things off. And so what I really admire, and we found some examples to put in the paper, is people who have come together and said, whether our joint agenda is, roughly children's oriented, so it's maybe childcare and home visiting and healthcare put together, or even a bigger picture, a broader care agenda between elderly people and young people, or some other combination, they've come together and said, we need to win, we need to come together to win. So that's what I would love to see. And before we go off, I just want to, Elizabeth Gaines has put in a wonderful comment that anybody interested in local ballot initiatives, please contact the Children's Funding project because they can help. So thank
Great.
you.
Well, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to all who have joined us today. I would encourage you, we have a number of exciting upcoming events at Capita, capita.org/events. Hope you'll join us. Thanks again to our panelists, and thanks again especially to Kim and Sarah for writing such a great and very practical paper. I'm sure it'll be well used. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.